G'day guys, and today we've got to discuss Australia's bid at the 2032 Olympics. Now of course I'm just going to put it out straight away that this is a terrible idea considering the state of Australia's economy and the actual costs of hosting Olympic Games. So even before you get to the actual games themselves, which are never profitable, I believe only Los Angeles was able to profit from the Olympic Games because it had the necessary infrastructure to run the games without too much construction taking place. Often the Olympic Games require billions, tens of billions of dollars in investment. We'll read off some of those numbers later. But even before you actually get to the hosting and the infrastructure and all that, that sort of stuff, even just the bid itself can cost a lot of money. So we can see that bidding costs range from 50 million to 100 million, and this is for fees for such as stuff like consultants, event organizers, and travel. For example, you can see back for the bid for the 2016 Olympics, Tokyo lost approximately $150 million. Now that's more money than you're probably ever going to see in your entire life, and this is just, for what exactly? I'm not exactly too sure what a country or a city gains from hosting the Olympics. There is of course a certain level of prestige, but that doesn't trickle down into the local economy, and there's been studies done on this. Of course, the idea is that if you host the Olympics, you're going to create jobs because you need to build all this infrastructure and you need to, host all these people that are coming to your country. But the problem with this is it's a very short-term economic gain, and most of the people that end up being employed as part of this scheme already have jobs. They're already employed, so it'll be like a contractor or something like that. So all the local construction companies will be hired rather than, say, people who are unemployed gaining employment from that. And it's a short-term benefit anyway, and you can end up, as is the case with Rio de Janeiro, with all your stadiums and athletes' villages essentially empty, not doing anything for you after you've spent billions of dollars. Of course, hosting the games itself, as I've mentioned, is a very, very costly process. Back in 2012, London paid $14.6 billion to host the Olympics and Paralympics, and of this amount, $4.4 billion came from the taxpayers. So of course that's not very handy, discussing in my last video wage growth and that sort of thing, and wages are pretty stagnant in Australia. They're barely keeping pace with inflation, and in a few years they actually haven't kept pace with inflation. And of course, do we really want to tax people more so that they feel this pressure a bit more? And well, ideally we'd say no, but perhaps some politicians, and indeed it appears some people, are saying yes in order for them to get that level of prestige. Because we have to ask ourselves, who's benefiting from this scheme? But it's certainly not the average person. They might get a few warm and fuzzies from knowing their country or the city is hosting the Olympics, but again, this doesn't translate to long-term economic growth. All it ends up doing is putting your city into massive debt, and this is still a problem from way back in the 2000 Olympics, which Sydney paid $4.6 billion hosting the Olympics in 2000. Of that, taxpayers covered $11.4 million. So yeah, $4.6 billion. Do you think that's been paid off by now? Of course not. That is a ridiculous amount of money. That probably won't be paid off within our lifetimes. And what was the benefit? Well, short-term infrastructure projects and prestige for politicians. That seems to be all I can garner from that. This is also an especially retarded times to be looking to spend this beyond extravagant amount of money, because we've got to think about Australia's debt, because as I've covered in a past video, Australia's debt is currently escalating at an exponential rate. I believe we're around $500 billion in debt. 550 billion is the number. I think this number has rapidly been increasing from the surplus we actually had in the early 2000s under the Howard government, but once the Labor government and later day Liberal governments got in power, the debts just keep spiraling out of control. No one is willing to cut spending anywhere, and yeah, we're in all this debt and we're looking to take on more in order to host the Olympics. Again, I'm not seeing how this benefits me, the taxpayer. Someone who it could potentially benefit is construction companies looking to embezzle money, because essentially when you have big one-off major projects or major builds and that sort of thing, it's a lot easier to hide how much it actually costs. Because if we have a look at building a road or whatever, roads get built all the time. We have an idea of how much a road costs, So say it costs $1 million to pave a kilometre of road. That's just an arbitrary number. And if you come along and it costs you $10 million to pave this kilometre of road, then people know, something fishy might be going on, and there's investigations and that sort of thing. But when we have these massive one-off infrastructure projects for things like the Olympics, well, there's nothing much to compare it to, and it makes it far easier to embezzle money. So that's someone who could be benefiting from the Olympics being hosted in Australia. Construction companies looking to embezzle money. In protest to this proposed bid for the Olympics, people are pointing out obviously where the money could be better spent, and a lot of people are talking about, say, drought-proofing Australia, so building up our dams and our irrigation and that sort of stuff, because of course Australia being a desert continent, we're highly prone to drought, and if our population keeps increasing due to mass immigration, we're crowding into these huge cities with huge demands of water, and we can't shuffle water around, well, a lot of people could die and suffer because we wanted to spend money on the Olympics. Something else to consider, what I pointed out in my Strait of Hamas video, is Australia's lack of fuel reserves. So we basically have next to no fuel reserves, a couple weeks at most. We're looking to get a hold of the US fuel reserves, but this may cost a lot of money. And where are we going to get that money from? Well, if we're going to waste a bunch of money hosting the Olympics, well, now we can't get a hold of fuel reserves. There's a lot of stuff we could be spending this money on. We can spend it on improved infrastructure, attempting to help homeless people. We can think about clean energy and that sort of stuff. There's a lot of clean energy projects going on in Australia at the moment. Obviously, waterproofing Australia is pretty important. Buying back our infrastructure from the Chinese, buying back farmland from the Chinese, restricting the selling off of Australia's assets to foreign interests. Perhaps we could even cut spending and cut taxes, but that's a bit extreme nowadays. That's an extremist position, wanting to reduce the size and power of the state, which is just alarming. But anyway, my point is there's a lot of different things we could be spending this money on, and it is absolutely exceptionally and singularly retarded at this point in Australia's economic state to be wanting to go into a lot more debt in order to gain a bit of prestige on the world stage. We don't need to gain a bit of prestige on the world stage. What we need is a strong functioning economy with wage growth, with a chopping down of Australia's debt. We really, really need to reverse this debt, guys. It probably wouldn't hurt to invest more in renewables. Of course, obviously we don't want to burden the planet too much, even though most pollution and stuff is caused in the countries like India and China. But we can do a little bit or whatever. We can help clean up the streets, obviously, of homeless people. We don't want homeless Australians sleeping outside. Shoot off to the side so the paparazzi can take photos of Olympic athletes. That's just stupid. Let's look out for Australia first. Let's look out for the Australian citizenship first, rather than the Australian politicians who just want that bit of prestige in order to be the politician who is in office at the time when Australia hosted the Olympics. So yes, I wholeheartedly reject Australia's proposal to host the 2032 Australian Olympics. There's a lot better stuff we could be spending the money on, and it's just beyond extravagant. It's stupid. We're just going to go into so much more debt, and there's nothing that we can really be gained from it in the long term. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.